In this house, on April the 23rd, in the year 1564, I made my debut, by which I mean I was born. My parents were John and Mary Shakespeare. John Shakespeare made gloves for a living, and in fact, if you look through this window here, you can see into his workshop where he would make gloves and other goods out of leather, and then he would sell them on a table to people passing by. Now, making gloves is an honest way to make a living, but for John Shakespeare, it wasn't quite good enough. He was a man of vaulting ambition. He wanted to be influential, he wanted to be powerful, he wanted to be, let's face it, better off. And the first step he took to achieve his social ambitions was to marry my mum. Mary was from the Avon family, and they owned land a mile or two in that direction. And you can still go and visit the Avon family farm today. So by marrying into a landowning family, John Shakespeare took his first step on the social ladder. But even that wasn't good enough. He worked his way up onto Stratford Council. His first job with Stratford Council was to be the town's ale tester. So all the beer that was made in the town had to go through my father, quite literally. Nice work if you can get it, but even that wasn't good enough for Dad. He worked his way right up to the very top of Stratford Council until he became what was known as the High Bailiff, which is the equivalent of being the mayor. Now, because he was the High Bailiff, it meant that me, as his firstborn son, got a free place at the local school. You had to pay to send your sons to school in those days. As a glove maker, he couldn't afford it. But as the High Bailiff, it meant I got that free education. So I learnt to read and write and all the rest of it, which obviously became very important to me in my chosen career later on. Now, I wasn't an only child, not by a long way. John and Mary Shakespeare were quite productive, shall we say it, and I'll try to list all my siblings for you now. First of all, they had a little girl called Joan. Now, I never met Joan because she only lived for 1 month. Then they had a little girl called Margaret, and I never met Margaret either. She lasted about a year. Then they had me, their firstborn son, and I lasted 52 years exactly, so well done me. Then there was my brother Gilbert. Now, Gilbert lived all his life here in Stratford, and he worked as a haberdasher. If you wanted fancy buttons or ribbons or tasteful shoulder pieces like this to bling up your outfit, you get them from the haberdasher. So that was Gilbert's profession. But he was also known as a local character around the town. At night he would go around the pubs and brag that he had caught the plague and survived. Well, if you catch the plague, you don't survive, but people would buy him drinks and celebrate his good fortune. It was probably just a case of man flu or something. We Shakespeares tend to over-dramatise things. There you go. Right, so that was Gilbert. Then there was my brother Richard, and then my brother Edmund. Now, Edmund was much younger than me, and when he heard what great fun I was having in London as an actor and the money I was making, he decided he wanted to do that too. So he followed me down to London to become an actor. Unfortunately, Edmund got himself murdered to death at the age of 27. And we don't know who did it or why, but knowing the kind of lad that Edmund was, we reckon he must have been up to something with another man's wife he shouldn't have been doing. And that's probably what led to his early death. And I do feel a little bit responsible. If I hadn't been boasting so much, perhaps he would have been content to remain here in Stratford, and he might have lasted a bit longer. So that was Edmund. Then my parents had a little girl called Joan, just like the first one who died. So either it was a tribute to her, or they were running out of ideas for names already. And then finally a little girl called Anne. Now, to add to the confusion, I got engaged to someone called Anne, and then ended up marrying somebody else called Anne. The Anne that I married was from the Hathaway family, and you can visit their family farm. It's about a mile or so in that direction. Anne was 26 when we got married. I was just 18. So she did well for herself, didn't she? And just 6 months after our wedding, our first child appeared. A miracle. Her name was Susanna, but I'll tell you more about her when we get to her place later on. Now I want you to try to imagine what this street was like back in the day. First of all, the buildings on both sides of the road would look very much like this one. People think Tudor buildings were black and white. They weren't. They were this sort of beige colour with the dark wood there. And this street is unusually wide for a Tudor street because it was the very end of town. At the end of the street there, it was all fields and farms. And so they needed a wide street to bring all the animals down to take them to market. So this street was covered in all sorts of dirt and filth and every shape, size and colour of animal poo you can think of everywhere you tread, as well as what everyone was throwing out of their upstairs windows by emptying buckets into the street, because no indoor plumbing in those days. And in fact, my father got in trouble with the law. The neighbours reported him and he had to go to court. And the judge said, "Mr. Shakespeare, you've let the pile of poo build up outside your house so much that no one can get round it." And he had to pay a fine of 1 shilling and get that poo moved. So at night, under cover of darkness, my brothers and I were equipped with shovels and given the task of shoveling that poo. Guess where we moved it to? That's right, we put it outside the neighbour's house. And if you look, the neighbour's house has long since gone. It's been replaced by a little red brick building with our family name on it. So I think we won that feud once and for all. Now the house is still here thanks to a writer you might have heard of. Don't worry if you haven't, he's not as good as me. A man called Charles Dickens? No, never mind. Anyway, in 1847 the house came up for auction. And an American you might have heard of, a man called P.T. Barnum, wanted to buy the house and take it on tour around America. And Charles Dickens quite rightly recognised this as a stupid idea. He banded together with some other writers, they got Prince Albert involved, and they won the auction. And they bought the house for £300, and it's been operated as a museum in honour of me ever since. So I'm grateful to Charles Dickens for recognising that the home of a superior writer should remain unmoved and unmolested. So cheers, Charlie. Behind me on the corner of Bridge Street and the High Street is a building that's also important in my story. It's now a gin shop called the Shakespeare Distillery. Yes, a gin shop with my name on. I'm so proud. But back in the day, it was a wine shop, so things haven't changed all that much. And the person who ran the wine shop was a man called Thomas Quiney. And he's important to my story because in the spring of 1616, he married my second daughter, Judith. Now, Judith was 31 when she got married. We thought we'd never get rid of her. But in February of that year, she and Thomas got married and they moved into an apartment above his wine shop. Now, we thought at last a happy ending for Judith. We were wrong. Thomas was not what you would call good husband material. It came to light just 3 days after their wedding that his girlfriend, Margaret Wheeler, had died in childbirth. So you can imagine when Judith heard about this, she begins to wonder what kind of man she saddled herself with. As if that wasn't bad enough, Thomas and Judith got married during Lent, that period before Easter where you're supposed to fast and not do anything fun. Well, apparently getting married counts as having fun, and if you wanted to get married during Lent, you needed a special license from the bishop. It turned out that Thomas never paid for this special license, and so as a result, when the bishop realised this, he excommunicated Thomas and Judith. Excommunication is a big word, it has big consequences. It meant that Thomas and Judith were no longer allowed to attend church. It meant that churchgoers were no longer allowed to have any dealings with Thomas and Judith. And when you think that everyone in town went to church, Thomas and Judith were suddenly isolated in society. It also meant that churchgoers couldn't pray for Thomas and Judith. And it meant that Thomas and Judith probably wouldn't go to heaven. And we thought this was a bit unfair. Judith was the innocent in all of this. So we sent Thomas off to the bishop with an apology and a bag of money, and at least one of those worked and they were allowed back in. But I could see the way things were going. I could see this man was not going to look after my daughter in the way that she deserved. I wasn't very well at the time and I was rewriting my will. So I stipulated in my will that Judith must have to herself £300. Very unusual for women to have their own money in those days, but Judith was granted £300. £300 then is more like £250,000 today. So I wanted Judith to be self-sufficient. Now, Judith was a twin. She had a brother, my only son, a little boy called Hamnet. Not Hamlet, like the play, Hamnet. And Hamnet and Judith were named after their godparents, so I didn't invent the name, it was pre-existing. Now, I didn't get to spend much time with my little boy. He was here growing up in Stratford, and I was working in London and touring shows around Kent and places like that. And one day, a letter came from home, and it said, "You must come back straight away, your son is dangerously ill." When you bear in mind that letters and things like that travelled by horse, from Stratford to London by horse is a good 5 days. So the letter was at least 5 days old by the time it reached me. Well, I dropped everything and came back as soon as I could, but it was too late. My little boy was gone. He was 11 years old. He should have died hereafter. And you never get over that as a parent. You're not supposed to outlive your children. You're not supposed to go to your own child's funeral. And it certainly changed me forever. It certainly changed the things I was writing about. My play Twelfth Night involves a pair of twins, brother and sister, who were separated by a shipwreck in this case. But by the end of the play, I was able to orchestrate a happy reunion and put those twins back together again. And writing that was sort of like therapy for me, because I couldn't do it in reality. I couldn't put Hamnet and Judith back together again. My play The Winter's Tale involves a parent separated from his infant daughter. And the daughter grows up in isolation, not knowing who she really is. But when she's 16, it all comes out and she finds her way back to her father for a happy reunion. Well, I've been waiting longer than 16 years. I haven't had my happy reunion with my boy. At the time of Hamlet's death, I was writing a play called King John. And halfway through the play, a woman called Lady Constance loses her little boy. Her son Arthur dies halfway through the play, and she's never the same since. But before she completely loses her mind, I gave her these words to say. And basically, the gist of it is she finds comfort in grief because while she's grieving, she can still imagine that her little boy is still there with her. She says, "Grief fills the room up of my absent child, lies in his bed, walks up and down with me, puts on his pretty looks, remembers me of all his gracious parts, stuffs out his vacant garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief." Well, that's a bit of a downer. Let's go to the pub. This house belonged to the second most famous family to come out of Stratford. And when I tell you what their surname is, you'll go, "Ah, I guarantee it." Now, in the middle of the 17th century, so that's 1600 and something, a member of this family, a young man called John, left England and he went across to the New World. He went to America. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, he built a library. That library grew into a university. That university became one of the most famous universities in the world. He was John Harvard. So Harvard College, as they call it, has its roots here in Stratford. But guess who they study at that university? That's right, me. So I won that one too. Here we are at one of the oldest pubs in town, the Garrick Inn. And it's named after a famous actor, David Garrick. He was the 18th century version of Sir Ian McKellen, a famous Shakespearean actor of the day. But why does he have a pub named after him here in Stratford? Well, one year he decided to spend his holidays here. He came up from London with a view to seeing my plays done on my hometown. But when he got here, they said, "Oh no, mate, we don't do that here. There's no call for that round here." And he thought that was outrageous. Well, it is. So in 1769, he produced the very first Shakespeare festival here in this town. It was a sort of pop-up theatre, like a circus tent kind of affair. And by all accounts, that first year, it was washed out by the rain. So imagine Glastonbury with tights on. But we remember David Garrick for starting the tradition of tourists coming here to watch my plays in my hometown. Well, he's got a pub named after him, big deal. I've got pubs named after me in every town you go to, so I won the pubs. But when I was born back in 1564, it wasn't a pub, it was a private residence. And the private resident who lived there was a weaver. And during that first few months of my life, this weaver took delivery of some supplies. And in those supplies, there were some fleas. And in those fleas, there was a disease known as the Black Death. So during my first summer, at least 30% of the population of Stratford was wiped out by the bubonic plague. As a tiny baby, I was very lucky to survive. And I always think, because my mum and dad had lost little Joan and little Margaret before I came along, perhaps they were a bit more careful with me when they knew this terrible disease was in the town. So I'm grateful to those two little sisters I never met if they made John and Mary Shakespeare better parents. Now, it is safe to go in the pub now. You won't get the bubonic plague. They've got hand sanitizers and everything. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed in because I'm barred. This is one of the oldest residences in town, known as the Shreve's House, and it's been here even longer than I have. It is now home to the well-renowned museum Tudor World. But back in my day, it was a pub called the Three Tuns. Tuns were huge barrels, so it's a good name for a pub. And it's important to my story because the landlord of the pub, the landlord of the Three Tuns, was a man called William Rogers. And I based one of my most popular characters on him because of his round red nose, his big belly, and his fondness for drink. So if you come across my character Sir John Falstaff, he's actually based on the man who used to serve drinks behind the bar here in this pub. In 1599, when I'd made a lot of money from my work at the theatres in London and my investments, I came back to Stratford and I bought the biggest house in town, and it stood on this corner. Because it was my new place, I called it New Place. I was always clever with words, you see. You might have noticed that the house isn't there anymore, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But if you want to imagine what New Place looked like, if you take a look at the neighbour's house, which has annoyingly survived, you will see that at the top, in the roof, there are two triangles, two gables. Well, imagine New Place standing beside it, the same height, but with 5 gables. Yes, we won the gables. And we were so well off, we had 10 fireplaces. Not all in the same room, obviously, but fireplaces, very expensive things to keep going. We also had a massive garden out the back. And because my son was gone, I thought if I plant a tree at the bottom of the garden, that will be there for centuries. Something will live on after me. Well, like the house, the tree is no longer there either, and it's all down to this same selfish individual I'm going to tell you about now. In 1750, the owner-occupier of my new place at the time got fed up with people knocking on the door saying, "Can we have a look at Shakespeare's tree? Can we have a cutting from Shakespeare's tree? Can we have a look round Shakespeare's house?" So the first thing he did to try to deter the visitors was to chop the tree down. Now, he sold the wood to a local craftsman. The craftsman made it into things like jewellery boxes and knick-knack boxes, and they still come up for sale now. So if you see, advertised for auction, a little box made out of Shakespeare's tree, don't fall for it. I reckon if you bought all of those boxes and put them together, you'd have enough for a forest of trees. So don't fall for that one. Well, the tree was down, but the visitor numbers were up. People were still knocking on the door day and night saying, "Can we have a look at the room where Shakespeare wrote The Tempest? Can we have a look at the room that he died in. Oh, spoiler alert, I'm dead by the end of this. Well, to stop the visitors coming once and for all, this man, this spiteful, selfish individual, he pulled the house down. You know, he could have sold it, he could have donated it to the town as a memorial to me, but no, he pulled it down. And when the people of Stratford saw what he'd done, they chased him out of town, and they passed a law saying that no one with his name is allowed to own property in the town ever again. His name was the Reverend, yes, he was a vicar, they're the worst, aren't they? The Reverend Francis Gastrell. So you won't find any Gastrells in the Stratford phone book unless they're operating under an assumed identity, and I wouldn't put it past them. But when you consider what good nick, what good condition my mum and dad's house is in, think how much better to visit my larger, more palatial new place would have been. But we've been robbed of that opportunity forever. This is the Guild's Chapel, and one of the reasons I like to bring people in here is to show off the beautiful stained glass window that's behind me. On the right-hand side is a gentleman you might recognise. Yes, it's my father, John Shakespeare, from his time as the High Bailiff of Stratford. So there he is, commemorated in stained glass, and I think that's pretty cool. I've yet to meet another person who can say, yes, my dad's in a stained glass window as well. So, no, I didn't think so, but there's mine. Another reason why I like to bring people in here, this chapel is right next door to the school, which we're going to look at in a minute. But when they wanted to get all the boys together in one room, we would all pile in here and sit on the cold stone floor. And every January, the older boys would perform a play for the younger boys. So it was in this building that I saw a play for the very first time. I'd never seen one before. I thought plays were something that we read in class. So can you imagine what that did to my tiny mind? Now, that play I saw, I remember it vividly. It was written by an ancient Roman writer called Plautus. It was performed in Latin, but I still enjoyed it. And it was about a pair of identical twins. And if you've ever had any dealings with identical twins, you know how sometimes you're not exactly sure which one you're talking to. Or sometimes they will deliberately pretend to be each other to try to catch you out. Well, this play was full of mistakes and misunderstandings and tricks, and I never forgot it. And years later, when someone asked me to write a comedy, I remembered that play, and I thought, what if you've got two lots of identical twins? Double the misunderstandings, double the mistakes, double the fun. And that play turned out to be The Comedy of Errors, which is still very popular today. Right next door to the Guild Chapel is my old school, and above my head is my old classroom. It operates as a museum now, like most things in this town, all to do with me, and you can go in and get shouted at by a man who will try and make you feel very small. He won't hit you with a stick though, so you don't get the full experience. School days were very long back in my day. We used to begin at 6 a.m. and go on till 6 p.m. and we had to come 6 days a week. So you can imagine I spent a lot of time in this room up there. And although I'm grateful for the opportunity to come to school, I didn't enjoy the experience very much at all. And I'll explain why, and perhaps you'll agree with me. So first of all, there was the long days. Next, we had to speak Latin all day, every day. If the teachers overheard us speaking English or Welsh or anything like that, our names would go on a list. And every Friday morning, the boys on that list would have their names read out and they would be beaten with sticks. So we learnt Latin pretty quickly, as you can imagine. We also learnt ancient Greek, so we could read the classics in their original form. And we also learnt French, because most of the boys who were paying to come to the school would be going on to university to study the law. And everything in the English legal system at that time was done in French, thanks to William the Conqueror. So when people say, how come Shakespeare knows French? Well, I learnt it up there. And that's why I was able to put some French-speaking characters into a couple of my plays, like Henry V, for example. And when you look at that French, it's sort of où est la bibliothèque kind of level, but there it is. As I say, I didn't enjoy the school experience very much. The other boys knew who my father was, the High Bailiff, so they knew I was there on a freebie, and they gave me a hard time because of it. When I was 15, though, my father lost his place on the council and he went back full-time to the glove shop. He kept it going part-time because he liked to keep his hand in, and I went to help him, and I was glad to get away from those other boys. But the whirligig of time brings in its revenges. It is still a school now. The modern school is tucked away behind the museum bit, and every year now, on my birthday weekend, all the boys who attend the school have to come to Stratford on the Saturday. They have to wear their school clothes. They have to parade through the town carrying flowers to my grave. So I think I won that one in the end. This fine example of early Tudor architecture is known as Hall's Croft, and it's named after its previous owner, Dr. John Hall, who is important to my story because he got married to my first daughter Susanna, and this is where they lived. And I was delighted when Susanna married a doctor, not just because it meant she had someone who was her intellectual equal to talk to over the dinner table, but it meant that I could start putting doctors as characters in my plays. I would go to John and say, look, there's a doctor here. What would he say? How would he behave? What would he prescribe? And for the price of a pint or two, he would tell me. So he was a very important resource to have in the family. Now, Tudor medicine, a bit different from what you might be used to these days. I'll give you a couple of examples and you can see what I mean. If you went to John Hall and said, oh, doctor, I've got a terrible sore throat. I haven't, I'm acting, don't worry. Doctor, I've got a terrible sore throat. He would say, what you need to do is get a live frog and put that in your mouth and keep it there for a day. Now, I'm no expert, but I think if you've got a frog in your mouth for a day, you can't speak because he's going to jump out. So you're giving your throat a good rest for a day, aren't you? So perhaps that's how it worked. Or perhaps there were some slimy properties about the frog's skin that would trickle down and ease the soreness at the back of your throat. I don't know. You'd have to ask John, he's the doctor. But we still say today, don't we? I've got a frog in my throat. If you went to John Hall and said, oh, doctor, I've got a terrible headache, he'd say, right, first of all, put that frog down. What you need to get is a live bird and put that in your mouth for a day. He was obsessed with putting things in your mouth. Now, he meant something like a wren or a sparrow. He didn't mean a goose or a swan, obviously. But I think if you're running around in the fresh air trying to catch a little sparrow, it's certainly going to distract you from your headache, and it's going to get the old circulation going, so your brain is less dehydrated as you go. So you'd have to ask John Hall about that. Now, my daughter Susanna, what can I tell you about her? She was quite simply the most intelligent woman I ever met, and I'm saying that as her father. Here's an example of how clever Susanna was. See if you can spot the clever bit in this story. On one occasion, when I was visiting from home, I let myself in and Susanna was sitting by the fire and reading a book. She looks up, she goes, hello, Dad. The clever bit? She was reading a book. She was a girl, and girls didn't go to school. They could be married off at the age of 13, just like poor Juliet. So there was no point in educating girls in those days. So how could she be reading a book? I certainly didn't pay for a private teacher to go around the house. She taught herself how to read. Quite an undertaking, I'm sure you'll agree, but how did she achieve it? Well, she'd get a piece of writing and she'd be on the lookout for some young man she liked the look of on his way home from school. And she'd approach him and she'd say, oh, that's a bit smudged. What does that say? And he would tell her. Or how do you pronounce that word? And he would tell her. So using questions like this, not only was it an excellent way to flirt with boys, it also taught her all the sounds that letters make. And she became a very fluent reader and writer indeed. Now, unfortunately for Susanna, she was born 400 years too early. There were no opportunities for women in those days. You were primarily a wife and mother, as indeed she was, or you might have a special role to play in the community, like a midwife or something, or you might be the Queen of England, but that job was already taken. If you want to know what Susanna was like as a person, have a look in A Midsummer Night's Dream. There's a bright young woman in that play, a character called Helena. That is my daughter Susanna, preserved for all time. And that's probably the best monument I could give her. 10 metres on the other side of this window is the Shakespeare family grave. And there are 6 of us in there. We weren't all wiped out in some horrible accident. We were obviously put in there over the years when the time came. And by the end of my life, I was influential and rich enough to afford a permanent resting place inside the building. I say permanent because if you were buried out here in the churchyard, the chances are you would not be there for very long. When this was the town's working churchyard, obviously with people dying all the time, it would become full up very quickly. And so what they used to do was dig up the old graves that no one visited anymore, take the bones out and put them in a special storage unit or shed called a charnel house. And they would put all the skulls on one shelf and all the hands on another shelf and all the legs on another. So you didn't know whose was whose and what was what. But if you keep doing that, then eventually, of course, the shed gets full up and would need emptying. So they would take all the bones from the shed, pile them up and burn them on a bone fire, which is where we get the word bonfire. Now, in my play Hamlet, there is a scene where Hamlet and his best friend Horatio are walking through a graveyard, and they come across a happy gravedigger cheerfully digging up an old grave to make room for a fresh dead person. And Hamlet's up for a laugh, so he stops for a bit of banter with this happy gravedigger. And he says, "Well, friend, whose grave was this?" And the gravedigger throws him the skull and says this was the king's jester. And Hamlet realises that when he was a boy, he used to play with this man. He used to jump on his back and ride him round the castle. And he does that famous line, doesn't he? "Alas, poor Yorick. I knew him, Horatio." Well, what happened to poor Yorick, I didn't want to happen to me. I did not want to be disturbed. And I was so serious about it, I wrote a curse for my gravestone. The curse is as follows: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Not the best thing I ever wrote, but I wasn't very well at the time. And for a long, long time, it did the trick. It kept people away. Now, a few years ago, Channel 4 Telly decided to make a documentary about the Shakespeare family grave. They were going to reveal who or what is in there once and for all. And they filled the church with X-ray equipment and radar equipment and sonar equipment like they have on submarines. They didn't bring shovels because they respected my curse. And they scanned the paving stones from end to end. And right at the far end lies my granddaughter, Elizabeth. And next to her lies her husband, Thomas. And next to him lies my daughter, Susanna. And next to her lies her husband, Dr. John Hall. And next to him lies my widow, Anne. And then they got to me. And on their monitors, they could see quite clearly my feet, my legs, my pelvis, my ribs, my hands, my arms. But where the skull should be, the dirt had collapsed because my skull is no longer in there to hold it up. So at some point in the past 150, 200 years, someone did break in and stole my head. My beautiful head that came up with all those poems and characters and plays and changed the English language forever has been nicked. Who would do such a thing? Well, this is exactly what I was afraid of. It was a fashion amongst the wealthy, people with more money than sense, to collect the skulls of famous people. And you can imagine them all showing off to each other. Look, I've got Napoleon. Look, I've got Julius Caesar. Well, I've got William Shakespeare, I win. You can imagine the scenes. And I think that my skull is in a collection somewhere, or it's been boxed away and the labels come off it and they don't know that it's me. But if they can find Richard III almost completely intact under a car park in Leicester, then it's not unreasonable to think that my skull will one day come to light, and they'll do all the tests on it and they'll prove that it's me, and I'll be put back together again like Humpty Dumpty never was. And then at last I'll be able to rest in peace and not have to lead tour groups around the town anymore. What a glorious day that will be. Now, what did I die of? Well, in 1616, a playwright friend of mine came up from London to visit me in my retirement. And we went and did all the pubs in Stratford and the local area, which is still a challenge if you're up for one. But unfortunately, during that night out, I contracted a chill that went to my kidneys, and that's what finished me off. And so on April the 23rd in the year 1616, I died. It was the occasion of my 52nd birthday. I never even got any cake. Worst birthday ever. When I was 47, I retired. That's not bad going, is it? And I came back to Stratford to enjoy my new place and the wealth that I'd created. At that time, Stratford Council had banned all public performance in the town. Actors, those disreputable people, were not allowed to come and do their jobs here. Things have changed completely. The tables have turned. The town is now dependent on actors performing my plays here to attract visitors from all over the world. Now, there wasn't a theatre, obviously, in Stratford when I lived here, and it took until 1879 for them to get around to building a permanent building. So 110 years after David Garrick and his pop-up circus tent, they finally realised there is mileage in this Shakespeare stuff. He's not going to go away. We can invest in a permanent building. And it stood on this spot, and it was called the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre. It opened in 1879. Sadly, it burnt down in 1926, and it took them till 1932 to rebuild it. In 1961, when the Royal Shakespeare Company was formed, or the Royal Me Company, as I prefer to call them, they decided to make their base here in Stratford rather than London. So they took over the theatre and named it after them. So this is the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. And as I said, it is now the town's main attraction to bring visitors in from all over the world.